Portcullis House, the Boothroyd room.
We will begin our proceedings for the final evidence-taking session this afternoon. Just waiting for our witnesses to... That's really helpful, isn't it? Because it's going to be right in front of you. Instead of walking around the back. And we welcome our first set of witnesses. I'm speaking slowly to give them a chance to assemble. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon and for being prepared to give evidence. I wonder if I could kindly ask you to introduce yourselves for the record, and then we'll move straight on to questions. Mr. Allen, would you like to go first?
My name's Robin Allen. I'm head of Cloisters Barristers Chambers. I have worked in the field of equality and human rights since the mid-1970s and have advised all the earlier commissions and the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Equality Commission of Northern Ireland and a lot of other commissions as well on human rights and equalities issues. And I've been particularly asked to advise the Equality and Human Rights Commission on this bill.
Thank you.
I'm John Wadham. I'm the General Counsel of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, a staff member.
Thank you.
Rachel Robinson. I'm a Policy Officer at Liberty.
Thank you.
And I'm Liz Bramley. I'm Head of Employee Engagement and Diversity for the Co-operative group.
Thank you very much. First question, Mr. Chris Bryant.
Are the provisions in relation to pensions in this bill fair?
If I could make a start there. Although we are incredibly supportive of this bill as a whole, this is the one area where we feel like there is still a substantive inequality in the bill. Committee members may know that Liberty recently represented before the Employment Tribunal John Walker, who challenged the decision of his occupational pension scheme provider to provide substantially less in terms of survivor benefits for his civil partner than would have been available to his spouse, a spouse in a mixed-sex relationship. At the moment, the way that survivor benefits accrue in occupational pension schemes, civil partners and under the bill also same-sex spouses will only be entitled to those benefits which have accrued since 2005. This creates real, tangible inequality for same-sex couples, and we think it's a real shame that in a bill which is in general so progressive, such a positive step forward, to see this inequality perpetuated.
How many people do you think that applies to? Because obviously some occupational pensions have a more generous provision than the law requires them to have.
Absolutely, and we hear from the government that 2/3 of occupational pension schemes already provide equality parity in provision for same-sex and mixed-sex couples. We would imagine on this basis that the liability to occupational pension schemes will be very limited, but for the individuals who are affected, the personal impact on them will be great. For example, in the case of our client John Walker, the survivor benefit which would have been available to his civil partner, just £500 per annum, as opposed to £41,000 per annum had it been a spouse. And I guess that the sort of real, to sort of help demonstrate the real inequality here, had John Walker today decided to end his civil partnership and marry a woman, somebody who he just met today, for example, she would be entitled to the full amount of that survivor benefit, and his civil partner, somebody he's been in a relationship with for a very long time, somebody who he got a civil partnership with as soon as it was possible for him to do so, is not entitled to that, and that's a real inequality.
Does anyone else on the panel wish to comment on the issue of pensions at this stage?
Well, obviously the Equality and Human Rights Commission welcomes the bill, and this is a very important step forward to equalise relationships. Obviously it will be sensible that the rest of the difficulties and discriminations were tidied up, so we take the same view, that it will be sensible for the consequential equality issues to be dealt with within the pension schemes more generally.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right. Kate Green.
May I follow this argument about pensions a little further? Would this provide for state pension or only occupational pensions, the legislation that you were the change in the legislation that you're seeking?
Our concern here is with occupational pension provision. We do understand there's some issue with differentiation between widow and widowers and other aspects of the regime, but as far as we're concerned, the real substantive inequality here is with occupational pension schemes, and we are only proposing or suggesting an amendment which in fact equalises treatment within occupational pension schemes.
And would that be both public sector and private sector occupational pensions?
We understand that at the moment for public sector pensions there is equality of treatment, or civil partners are treated in the same way as widowers. The real inequality is in the fact that there is an exemption for private occupational pension providers, an exemption to the duty to provide equal provision for same-sex and mixed-sex couples.
I don't think the legislation specifies, the Equality Act, I don't think it says specifically it's private sector occupational pension scheme providers, does it?
Well, in our sort of consultation with government on this, until very recently, it's been very clear. For example, when we were taking forward our case, challenging the same provision in relation to civil partnerships, that the liability they foresaw arising from the case was a liability to private pension schemes. I understand that recently there has been attempts to formulate an argument that there will be some impact on the public purse here, but as far as we can see from our legal analysis, that isn't the case. In fact, what we're looking at here is a small increase in liability to private pension firms who, in any event, deal in risks and uncertainties. That's the nature of the work they do.
Thank you.
And have you, could I just ask one last question? Have you any, I know what you say, and therefore I assume you don't see this as especially burdensome on private occupational pension providers, not so much in terms of cost, although you might want to comment on the likely cost to them, but in terms of the management of their pension schemes?
As far as we're concerned, there will be a very small increased liability. The government's concern about there being a retrospective liability on these schemes is rather misplaced. As far as we can see, it rather implies that there would be some way for these schemes to predict how many members of a particular scheme would be gay, how many would go on to form a civil partnership, how many would be survived to any significant extent by a partner, all incredibly speculative. Individuals who are in same-sex relationships pay into their schemes in exactly the same way as everybody else, and it's simply unfair that they be asked to bear this additional burden and be treated in this unequal way.
Thank you very much. Tim Loughton.
Thank you, Chairman. The submission we've had from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which I think is a good submission, makes some interesting points, does raise some concerns about, in particular, the legal position for a minister in a church that opts in, but he or she doesn't want to conduct them. And just to quote a line, it says, the legal opinion suggests that the bill in its present form could amount to the state acting unlawfully by interfering with the freedom of religious organisations to enforce their religious doctrines within their particular organisation. Can you elaborate on that and what it would take to remedy that within the bill, if it can be?
I think I was the author of the bit of that, so the baton's been handed to me. As you will know well from your earlier discussions, the bill itself has been built on this idea of the quadruple lock of freedom of conscience. And the Commission's overarching view, as I understand it, and certainly we think this is overarchingly right and correct, is that the bill treads a very careful and thoughtful line in protecting freedom of conscience. But in Clause 2, there's a provision which essentially says that a minister, and I use the word minister to cover all sorts of religious persons who conduct ceremonies, cannot be compelled to conduct a ceremony which they don't agree with between same-sex couples. The situation that gave us some concern within the Commission was this, that you have a religious organisation that wishes to opt in and does so on doctrinal reasons, so that the doctrine of that particular religious organisation agrees with the concept of same-sex marriage, but a possible employee, office holder, call it what you will, who has the responsibility for conducting those ceremonies, does not agree with that doctrinal change. And as things stand at the moment, on one reading of Clause 2, that organisation would not be able to discipline, take action against that individual who was in doctrinal opposition with its organisation on this particular point. Now, it may be that that's a policy decision for government to take in promoting the bill, that the best way to secure the most full protection of individual conscience is to have Clause 2. But it's this point at which individual conscience within a religious organisation of an individual minister comes into conflict with the doctrine of the organisation itself that we are a little bit concerned about. I see the difficulty because it could be said that couple want to get married, minister refuses, a couple then go to the organisation and say, we can't get married even though you agree with this policy, what are you going to do about it? Question then, what happens if the organisation removes that minister or disciplines them in some way or another? Is the individual who's got a conscience problem being compelled in some form or another? That's the conflict.
And do you think that the legislation should clearly enable the organisation to discipline that individual? And this brings in the bigger argument of, in order to comply with the law, should a whole organisation, and I'm mostly talking about non-religious organisations here, I'm talking about ministers here, have to only employ people, all of whom are compliant with being in favour of same-sex marriage in this case? Or do you think we should, your personal view, enable flexibility so that as long as an organisation does offer that service, it doesn't require every single person employed by or affiliated to that organisation to go along with it? Do you think that is a sustainable situation, or should everybody have to comply and therefore the organisation would have the power to discipline backed up by the law?
Well, can I just... I think the first question is quite right. The issue of, if you're a member of a religious organisation or church, then in a sense you request that organisation to marry you, and in a sense it's not for you to choose whether you have a particular minister. So to that extent, I think the policy is correct, that individuals shouldn't be able to go looking around at people who might have conscientious objections or religious beliefs contrary to the views of the organisation, because in a sense that's an issue for the organisation itself. Our anxiety, however, is that irrespective of whether or not that individual, that couple can take proceedings or to cause trouble, the organisation as a religious organisation which establishes its own doctrine, or the doctrine is derived from the way in which it was set up, should be able to ensure that it can take action against its own employees, its own ministers. And our anxiety is that this bill may prevent that happening. So it's not actually from the point of view of the couple that we're concerned about. It's more about the freedom of the religion to organise its own affairs without the state, in this case the law, saying you are not allowed to discipline this person, which will be a step too far, we say, in terms of an interference with religious freedom for that particular religious organisation.
So you favour 100% conformity by every member?
No, that's not what... No, if the religious organisation doesn't want 100% conformity, that's entirely up to that organisation. Yeah. But if it does want 100% conformity, it's not for the law, I don't think, to step in to say you can't have that. And I think that these two policy objectives could be resolved by amending the bill so that you both don't allow a same-sex couple to force an individual to marry them, but at the same time allow the religious organisation to police its own ministers and staff. And I think that's possible. So I think these two things are a bit mixed up, and we were a bit anxious about that. But obviously, I wouldn't want that to take away from the importance of this bill.
Conversely, then, in the cases we had in the ECHR involving civil partnerships, and a registrar who said he or she, I can't remember which it was, couldn't perform those ceremonies. you're not in favour of flexibility where if that authority has said, well, we will accommodate her, and if we've got 6 registrars who do everybody and 1 registrar who will only do some, that wouldn't be permissible as far as you're concerned, that she should have been forced along with everybody else to do all or nothing.
But I don't think those are parallel circumstances, because in relation to the registrar, particularly the registrar's responsibility as a public official is to deliver a service to the wider public. As a member of a church or a religion, then the responsibility of that person is to follow the doctrine of the church or that religious organisation, and those are 2 different things. And we are saying that it's for the religious organisation to be allowed to police those circumstances. And that's not so it's not on parallel with the Delhi point.
Can I add a small point to it? Well, 2 things. I don't disagree with anything that's been said by Mr. Wadham, obviously. One short point. It might achieve the aim that the Commission have in mind here. I'm not saying that it will definitively do that, because we haven't had enough thinking time on this, but it might achieve the aim if Clause 2.2, which says a person may not be compelled to conduct a relevant marriage, had in it a person may not be compelled by a couple wishing to get married.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
That would certainly go some way in curing the defect that we think arises. The second point is whether these points that we've articulated and been debating here mirror the situation for Ms. Ledaly. The short answer, I agree entirely with Mr. Wadham, they don't. Ms. Ledaly and all registrars of marriage are paid to work for the state in its various emanations to provide the service of conducting civil marriage ceremonies. And what this Act does is redefine the concept of civil marriage. And that's the answer, in short.
Thank you very much. Jim Shannon.
And again, thank you for coming along. I have a couple of questions if I can ask you for clarification. First of all, in relation to the Roman Catholic adoption agencies, they've made a very, very clear stand where they have concerns over adoption and how the law will constrain them and restrict them and what they feel biblically and religiously they can't do. I'd like to get your opinion on that. I think you also mentioned, Mr. Allen, about giving some advice to the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. I had a meeting with them back in early December, spoke about some lengths, and I would be keen to get your opinion, because obviously in Northern Ireland Assembly took a decision not to agree to same-sex marriage, and that was it. But your opinion to them, because I've asked them for their opinion, so I'd like to get perhaps maybe if your opinion...
If you'll allow me to interrupt just a second, I've given no advice to the Northern Ireland Equality Commission on this issue at all.
Right. Okay, that's fair enough. That makes, I've already had their opinion, so I was keen to see whether your opinion was similar to theirs, but you're not able to tell me that. Also, I'm interested in how the Equality and Human Rights Commission, perhaps you could, I mean, your organisation is well known for intervening in cases where Christians and people with religious beliefs are taken to task on whatever those issues may be, whether it be foster carers, B&Bs and so on. Can you tell us how many times that you've supported a claim brought by a traditional Christian, and how many cases have you pursued against traditional Christians? In other words, how many Christians have you taken their cases for, and how many have you done against them? That's my questions.
Well, the answer to that is in the case, the most recent case decided, the case of Awada, we intervened in the European Court of Human Rights to support her case, and I'm very pleased that she was successful. The Commission has a very difficult job in the sense that it promotes equality and human rights across the board, so it wants to ensure that lesbian and gays have rights of equality and are not discriminated against. But as I've tried to indicate, the main point that we've debated so far is to give religious organisations as much freedom as we possibly can, and that's our our wish. A year ago, I met with all of the Christian organisations and many other organisations to work with them to try and support as many cases where they believe that their religious rights were being interfered with, or that they were being discriminated against in relation to their religion. So that's always been my approach during the period that I've been at the Commission. And secondly, it is our public stance. Now, the fact that there are some religious individuals who have decided for doctrinal reasons and other reasons to discriminate where it is unlawful, including in relation to the denial of access to bed and breakfast, for instance, is problematic. And I'm very sympathetic to those people who, for those religious reasons, do so. But it is unlawful, and it isn't acceptable for gay and lesbians to be turned away from commercial premises for reasons which are not acceptable. It is possible, and I think we are trying our best to resolve those issues, but actually it's a hard job to do, and we try and do it as best we can. Not everyone likes what we do, and I can tell you that we are criticised from all sides. I don't know whether that's a result or not.
Mr. Shearer, on that question, ask for the numbers. Perhaps if you haven't got the details today, the numbers of those traditional Christians that you've supported and those that you haven't, and maybe for this, what's unanswered, the request has been made, maybe you can reply to those. I asked you a question about the Catholic Adoption Agency and their concerns about how this will legally change their position in relation to adoption. Have you got a...
Oh, sorry.
Can you give us some reassurance in relation to that, if you can?
Well, I think that the difficulty for your committee and the difficulty with this bill is that, of course, what is happening is this is being a focus of a significant number of issues, and as far as I understand it, it doesn't have any effect whatsoever in relation to the Catholic Adoption Agency's ability to promote its services or not. The issue here is about marriage for same-sex couples, and of course, as Robin has already said, this is a very, very important development. It's an incredibly good bill, and I wouldn't want these other issues to get in the way of actually this bill being going through Parliament and getting royal assent as soon as possible. There are real
concerns that people have.
I understand that there are genuine concerns, and actually we are, collectively, this society is developing new ways of trying to support both the rights of lesbian and gays, but the freedom of expression of the freedom of religion of a lot of different religious organisations. This bill is an important part of that development. It doesn't solve all of the other problems, which are still difficult and difficult to resolve.
Thank you. Tim Loughton.
If a foster couple belonged to a faith organisation
that had opposed this legislation, and they expressed their own opposition to same-sex marriages as being legitimate, and as a result of that a local authority no longer used them as foster carers, would you support them, the foster carers, and would there be a case to be made in support of them?
The key issue in relation to adoption and foster care, of course, is the interest of the children.
Correct.
And in a sense, it is possible, and I hope it will continue to be the case, that the religious or political views of the foster parents or the adoptees, potential adopters, are irrelevant to whether or not they can look after the children. There are circumstances where if foster parents or those people who want to adopt say actually some kinds of sexuality are unacceptable and not genuine, then there are real issues about whether or not the local authority or the organisation can place children there in case, or it's impossible to know whether what the sexual orientation of those children will be, or as they grow up, or alternatively when they're trying to explore what the issues are. That creates difficulties, but foster parents of all religions and of all persuasions can deal with that. Some individuals won't be able to do so, and that's a difficult assessment by the local authority. But a person's religious views or a person's political views shouldn't get in the way of them being able to look after children. The question is, are they going to treat children fairly and equally, and some people's religious views do prevent them treating children equally, and that presents a problem for the local authority.
That's my point, and I entirely agree with you, absolutely, that the paramount consideration must be what's the best for that child. So I assume that the actual answer to my question is yes, you would defend them, but will you define the threshold at which it becomes detrimental to that child for them to be in the care of parents who hold those views? Clearly, if they were to express those views in terms of being malicious towards gay people generally, or if that child turned out to be gay, being prejudicial to that child, that would be clearly not in the interest of the child. But holding those...
It's the marriage bill.
No, but it's the holding the view that same-sex marriage is not legitimate, that is germane to this, which is the principle. If there are people who hold that view, at which point does it then become serious repercussions for their ability to look after that child, brilliant foster carers that they may be?
I have to answer the question in exactly the same way I did earlier, which is that the issue isn't people's political or religious views, it's actually how they treat the children. Okay, so it's impossible for me to decide in advance. If somebody is opposed to this bill, that doesn't make them unable to look after children, whether they're gay or lesbians or they're developing their own sexuality. Of course, that will be completely wrong. Good. There will be circumstances where people who have religious views won't be able to treat children fairly and equally, and that's when the local authority won't be able to place children with them.
That's fine.
So, Chairman, could I just add this? I think one of the subtleties of this bill is that because it allows for opt-ins and opt-outs, it recognises that individuals that hold different views about the nature of marriage from what civil marriage will become after the bill is passed do not have a mark of Cain upon them forevermore. No. It recognises people may have different views about what religious marriage is or what civil marriage should be. And so I don't think it's possible to state that there's a threshold at which holding those different views would cause difficulties in an adoption context. Turn it round and look at it from the other point of view. Adoption decisions are never solely about the parents. They're almost always primarily about the children, the adoptive parents. They're almost always about the children.
Okay.
Well, in law it certainly is true, and that's the important thing for you, because you've got to get the law right, you've got to state what the law is right. The enforcement of the law is a different issue.
Thank you. We're going back to this bill with Chris Bryant.
That seems like quite a challenge. Could I just ask the Co-op, because you're obviously an employer?
Yes.
I wonder what your answer to the question about pensions is, and what you already provide to your staff.
Yeah, so we have a number of pension schemes, but our main pension scheme, which is open to all of our people, actually uses the terminology of qualifying partners. So in terms of how people nominate the benefits of their pension scheme, we would recognise any significant nomination that they have already. I think we would have to go back and look, because we've probably got some old schemes and we've probably got some schemes where the rules were written a very long time ago. I'm not a pensions expert, but we could certainly investigate the impact of that if that was of interest.
But survivor benefits then would be exactly the same for whoever
absolutely.
You nominated, regardless of whether they were your wife or whoever you nominated.
Or even if there was no ceremony at all, people were just living together regardless of sexuality.
Which is exactly the same as the parliamentary
pension,
in actual fact.
Kate Green.
Can I ask your views on the implications of the bill for transgender people?
We understand that the provisions around pensions will have an impact for trans couples around occupational pensions. For example, a trans couple where one partner transitions to become the same gender will then find themselves having expected and paid into the scheme in the same way as all other originally mixed sex couples to receive certain benefits, certain survivor benefits. They will then find themselves unable to, as same-sex spouses, unable to receive those benefits. I think the committee's already heard from representatives who deal specifically with the rights of the trans community. We are our main and principled points about this is we are very pleased to see that trans couples will not have to end their marriage in order to legally transition, and that's obviously an incredibly important point for us.
Do you think there's any need to reintroduce the fast-track procedure for gender recognition?
I'm afraid I'm not sort of sufficiently able to kind of give the detail about that, but we think that for transgender couples, the process should be as accessible as possible.
John Wadham wanted to come in.
I'm afraid I didn't hear the details.
I asked if you felt there was any need or any advantage to reintroducing a fast-track procedure for gender recognition, which used to exist under the Gender Recognition Act.
I think that it's good to see the measures in the bill as they are. I think that they should have been implemented some time ago. So I think anything that we can do to ensure that the difficulties for some particular individuals that have been waiting for this are resolved as soon as possible. Whether that should be as a fast-track process, but I think that we should do so very quickly as soon as the bill gets royal assent.
Thank you very much. Well, colleagues, unless there are any other burning questions, it's time. A final question to Jim Shannon.
Your organisation has in the past, I think you've funded training for the British Humanist Association on religious freedom, which also obviously would impact upon those in the redefinition of marriage and where we are in this debate today. Could you give us some indication of how you came to support that organisation and perhaps maybe not directly the religious organisations?
So I missed the beginning of that. I didn't know whether that was...
You funded training, ECHR funded training for the British Humanist Association on religious freedom. I'm wondering how that gives you balance and fair play for other organisations, how they see that.
Well, during the first few years of the Commission, we had a budget of about £10 million which was given to us specifically to fund all organisations, both religious organisations, humanist organisations, secular organisations, etc. And we spent that money in the best way possible. The fact that we gave money to one organisation doesn't in any way suggest that we are beholden to that organisation any more than any other organisation. We gave money to other religious organisations. I'm afraid I don't have the details in front of me, but obviously we can get back to you with that later.
Can I very briefly
yes, of course,
answer that? As a human rights organisation, as the Commission decides and tries to provide support for fundamental rights across the spectrum of rights and freedoms. That is exactly what Liberty has done throughout its history. The questioning today has been quite specific, but we're very keen to get across that whilst we have this one concern about pensions, we are really delighted to see a bill which marks a real landmark development in equal rights. And we are delighted that the government has gone to such efforts to ensure that religious organisations, their values, their beliefs, their traditions are protected and respected. We think they've done that incredibly cleverly and in a fail-proof way, and we very much support the spirit of this bill.
Thank you very much.
Can we get those figures, Mr. Streeter, in addition to the £10 million spend? Just the breakdown of how that was the organisations that benefited.
I'm sure if one would like to send us those numbers, that would be very helpful. But
thank you.
Other than that, thank you very much indeed for coming today and giving us your evidence. It's been most helpful. Thank you. We'll move on now to our next set of witnesses. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hayman and Mr. Parr, for coming and giving evidence today. If you'd like to introduce yourselves for the record, and then we'll leap straight in with some questions for you.
I'm Craig Parr.
Craig Parr. Thank you.
Joe Hayman, I'm the Chief Executive of the PSHE Association, and PSHE is Personal Social Health and Economic Education.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chris Bryant.
Yeah, I always get my H's and my S's the wrong way around in that stuff that you do, and you're in favour of, and I'm very in favour of, and sex and relationship education, all the rest of it. Do you think that do you have any problems with the bill in terms of what teachers would or would not be able to teach? Does it make life more difficult, easier for them, or does it not make any difference at all?
I mean, I think the first thing that I stress is that PSHE is a challenging subject to teach. There's a range of challenging issues which are approached every single day, from sex and relationships education through to gambling, alcohol, drugs, all kinds of different issues. I think PSHE teachers are very skillful, but I think they need more support. In terms of this specific bill, I think the range of issues that we're going to discuss are already being discussed in schools, in playgrounds across the country, and therefore I don't envisage a major change from our perspective.
Parr, did you want to, please?
Well, I mean, I've spent the morning teaching Year 7s about puberty, and we do that because of PHSE. It's not statutory, it should be statutory. And I'm very, very glad that citizenship is not being kicked off the curriculum. But in the wash-up of the last Labour government, it was. And that's a shame, and that's held us back.
Right, thank you very much. Tim Loughton.
Chairman, I don't think we've had a submission from schools out, so it might just be useful if Mr. Parr said who they are, who you represent, and just what your basic points are.
At the NUT, which I'm a member of, has put a submission in, and I go along with that. But Schools Out is an organisation that works with schools and interested parties in order to create a climate where children can feel happy, out and proud.
Is it a charity? Is it just a...
It's a charity, yeah. It's an organisation. It's made up of members like myself who teach in schools. I teach in a school in Camden. And it's made up of people, interested parties. So we work on having days such as, in February, it's LBGT History Month. So we promote diversity within the curriculum, whether students are gay and lesbian and whether students are not. But it's promoting that diversity in our classrooms.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Could I ask, probably... a representative from the PSHE, in your note, which I thought was a good note, and absolutely I agree with you about this is a really difficult subject, and the government needs to do more to make sure we've got proper SRE and good quality SRE, because it's a bit of a lottery, as we know at the moment. And in your note, you make the point about PSHE and SRE within that is a subject often taught by non-specialist teachers, and it's particularly challenging for them to deal with it. Personally, I think we should have many more specialist teachers doing it. We don't. It may be Mrs. Miggins, a geography teacher, as I always quote, who has a free couple of periods on a Thursday afternoon. Therefore, she's in charge of SRE for this term. So, how do we deal with those teachers who find themselves teaching SRE, whether they necessarily wanted to or not, who have strong objections to what this bill would do? And it's not just about teaching facts and what the law says. They will be challenged for their view. And although you say it's good practice, I don't disagree with that, we should try and keep opinions out of it, inevitably they will come into it. So what happens in those circumstances?
Well, I think that good quality PSHE teaching is all about presenting a balanced argument and supporting children and young people to develop the skills and attributes that they need to make up their own minds on a given issue. And as I said earlier, they deal with a wide, PSHE takes in a wide range of challenging issues. I think there is an issue, as you say, about the training for teachers, and it is too often delivered by non-specialists. But I think your point about a strong source of conviction on an issue could be equally applicable to a specialist and to a non-specialist. I think what we would stress is that teachers should be able to go into the classroom and provide balanced information based on fact from authoritative sources. If they don't feel that they can do that on a matter of conscience, then there may be some way that they can exchange with another teacher within their department. We don't think that it's ultimately in the best interest of a child to be taught on any given issue by a teacher who feels compromised. I don't think that's a good experience for the teacher or for the child. But I would stress that teachers have the opportunity to contribute to the school putting together its sex and relationships education policy alongside parents and community members, and therefore should have the opportunity to feel that they've been part of developing that process in the first place.
You use the phrase maybe some way that they could do a...
We'll come back to you in a second. We've got plenty of other colleagues. Kate Green.
To what degree, if at all, do you think that this legislation could impact on homophobic bullying in schools?
I mean, first of all, I think it starts from the top. So the ex-children's minister should have voted for equal marriage in Parliament, and that would have sent messages to other people that Parliament, you know, and I commend the Conservative government bringing through this legislation. But that's where it should start. I think that, I mean, for example, I was having this debate with my class yesterday, my Year 7 form group, and I said, what's in the news, what's people talking about, and a young girl brought up the equal marriage debate. And all of the class bar one agreed that gay people, gay and lesbian people should have the same rights to marry as other people. Bar one young girl, and she was a young Muslim girl, and she said that I don't agree with equal marriage because of my religion. And we tried to explore that issue some more, and another girl put her hand up and said that she was also a Muslim, but she agreed with equal marriage because of her religion and because she...
Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room.